Yeah, working fuel gauge, that was the problem all along. After all of that work, that was the problem. It wasn't polarity, it wasn't the fuel levels float, it wasn't the sender, it wasn't wiring at the PCM, it wasn't fuses, it was the tune. Somewhere along the line, an 07 configuration file was flashed on my 05 through multitude of tuning sessions, and my fuel gauge has not worked in a long time. So what am I talking about here, right? Is it just in the tune, or was there more going on? Well, this car has a full fuel system. It has 2 fuel pumps, 3 fuel filters, 2 check valves, 25 feet of 6AN line, all custom. A lot of this was done around the time I lost fuel gauge functionality. So the frustrating part for me was I attributed it to the mechanical work I was doing on the car. What I didn't realize is there was a bit of a gremlin, a ghost in the tune that was introduced by opening up 2 tune files and comparing and copying over selected portions of another tune. Actually changed the operating system that was flashed on the car. What I mean by that is 2005 cars, particularly mine, that's a very early 2005 car. Mine actually has some 2004 Saturn parts on it. Anyway, early build. The fuel gauge is inverted from the 06 through 2010 clusters. So the computer sweeps the fuel gauge the opposite direction depending on the resistance from the fuel sender. So this is a fuel sender. It has a float, it has a little resistor, and what happens is as the fuel fills up, this float changes the resistance coming out of this plug. And the computer reads that resistance to sweep the gauge to say whether it's full or halfway or whatever. There's a little stepper motor in the cluster. So what I did, and I'm hoping that this helps somebody that's having future problems, but I went through every possible step in troubleshooting this fuel gauge situation. I did a full continuity check from the pins on the PCM all the way back to a connector right by the fuel tank. I knew the lines were good. I knew the plumbing was good. I checked every bit of electrical resistance I possibly could. What I did is I took my ohm meter, and when this is empty, it should be about 40 ohms of resistance. So if you take your plus and minus and go on the colored wires, the resistance between the two when empty or all the way down. And again, you can check this inside the car while it's got fuel in it. When you check across these 2 pins here, you're going to be about 40 amps empty and about 240 or so, sorry, not amps, 240 or so ohms of resistance full. So 40 empty, about 240 full. Well, that was checking out. I had replaced this sending unit thinking it was bad. I had changed every possible part on the fuel system, so I couldn't figure out what was going on. The only possible things that were left were pull out the instrument cluster, and maybe I had a bad stepper motor, but all my other gauges were working fine, and the fuel gauge was accurately sweeping. It's just I was making fuel as I was driving instead of it being empty. When I fueled up with the 85, it would say low fuel. As I drove, that low fuel light would come off, and it would be further up showing full on the gauge. So I knew the instrument cluster was not the issue, the gauge cluster was not the issue. It left me with one thing, and that was the computer. A lot of things I had read were the dealership would need to flash a calibration to the correct year model on the computer. And I didn't want to go through all that. So I went back through my old files. I was able to find a stock file. I did a right entire in HP tuners, which basically reverted everything to a stock car, 2005 configuration and everything. because the operating system on the 2005 is different than 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10. So once I did that, I had to go copy all of the tune data because it's turbo and huge injectors and everything else. And I didn't want to introduce a new problem back into this stock file. So I went literally cell by cell and copied the information over. So every table, every parameter, every value, I copied over by hand into a stock file that I saved as a new tune file. And that new tune file, I did a right calibration because I'd already done a right entire on the car. And then I went ahead and did a right calibration with this new updated file that I was pretty certain was still a 2005 operating system. As soon as I did that, fuel gauge worked. So, reason for this video is to hopefully avoid some of the troubleshooting that I did. If you are in a modified Cobalt and you are tinkering around with stuff with the tune, particularly 05 car, this could be an issue. Now, what other things could it be if your fuel gauge is not working or fuel gauge is sweeping backwards? Well, like I said, inverting the polarity at the plug by the fuel sending unit will not do anything. So if you take, and I'll throw up a picture of this, but if you take pins 3B and 3D and try and flip them so that your fuel level signal and your fuel level low reference are flipped, it will not work. In fact, your gauge just sits at its last position. It doesn't do anything. So I flip those back. One thing that is key is the orientation of the fuel canister assembly when you're putting it back together. There is a particular way this goes. What I ended up doing is looking on a parts website that had a picture of the fuel pump sending unit assembly, and I noticed which direction the lines were pointing in relation to the float, and made sure things were oriented that way. And then when I was assembling it, I made sure the leg of this did not get hung up. So I am not kidding when I told you I've dropped my fuel tank. Now, if I said 100 times, that might be a little exaggerated, but probably not off by much. But a lot of that was chasing down fuel pump issues, chasing down plumbing issues, things like that along the way. But the car didn't have a working fuel gauge for a few years. I ran it out of gas multiple times. And on a car on the E85, not knowing where your next fuel station is and not knowing how long you have until you run out of fuel, big issue. So hopefully this helps somebody. If not, get at me. I can probably sort you through it. I was going to show what I meant on the tune file and go from there. So this connector here, you can access in one of two ways. This part is riveted underneath the seat facing downward to the fuel tank. This connector is underneath the car and needs to be unplugged. But this connector is connector 3 on this multi-port or multi-pin connector. And pins 3B and 3D are the two fuel level sensor signals. These two, 3B and 3D, are what you would probe with your multimeter, but your tank either has to be completely empty or completely full to know either 40 ohm empty or 240 or so full. So if you had half a tank, you would probably know that it had resistance greater than 40, but I don't know that it would tell you if it was reading accurately or not. I'm showing you this because I gave a shot at trying to invert the polarity to make it sweep the correct direction. That won't work. 3, I believe it's 3B is the low reference. It does not allow the gauge to invert polarity. It's not a ground in that sense. You're basically dealing with, I believe, 5 volts versus 12 volts. Anyhow, so you're going to check the ohms across these two pins here and here on the connector harness side, not on the receiver connector side. So on the tune, I wanted to show this. So this was my tune file I was using, and it had been modified hundreds of times along the way of adjusting things and so forth. But somewhere along the way, it had picked up an operating system of an '07 car and not an '05 car. One thing on these, you can't really check the OS. On these cars, it just doesn't have that much brain in the P12 computer on these LSJs. But what I ended up doing is opening a really old, I think this one's 14 years old, M62 file, and flashed right entire. And the HV Tuners even gives you a little warning about it could break your computer. That wasn't great. So when you go right vehicle, you would select right entire on that '05 to revert it back to the operating system. Then what I did is I went table by table, value by value, and copied it into that stock file. And then at that point, I just was able to do a right calibration because I'd already done the right entire, like I said. So I just wanted to show the changes I made, which ultimately ended up fixing it. Again, if anybody has any questions, get at me. Jap out.